HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Spiced to Death by Peter King, read by David Baker.
Chapter 1. The food looked appetizing enough. It was the styrofoam and the plastic wrap that spoiled the visual impact. I opened the little package containing a knife, fork, and spoon, a paper napkin, salt, and pepper. It wasn't easy to open. Why did they make the plastic so strong? Pulling out the fork, I broke one of the tines. Why did they make the plastic so weak? But I wasn't here to make a critical survey of the plastics industry, so I turned my attention back to the food. The small salad wasn't too bad. The tomato slices were surprisingly tasty, and the lettuce was reasonably crisp. Not an easy achievement when it has been tightly wrapped for hours. The mustard greens and the endives were acceptable, and the tiny croutons were crunchy. The dressing was too thick and too sweet for my preference, but there was no pleasing every salad eater among the tens of thousands of airline passengers being served this same meal. There was sufficient vinegar in the dressing, despite its sweetness, that I waited to finish before pouring the red Bordeaux into the plastic cup. Plastic is a terrible surrounding for any wine, especially a wine which is already struggling vainly against the disadvantaged background of being without a vintage, the vinous equivalent of being illegitimate. Chapter 2. I had first met Don Renshaw some years ago. I was living and working in London, and he was visiting from his native Cornwall, where he had a small boat-building business. His customers were mostly fishermen, who had been coming to him with increasing frequency, asking how to get rid of their extra catches of lobster, crab, mussels, and fish. A mutual acquaintance put us in touch with each other, and I suggested that he start a soup cannery. I helped him do this, and as the business prospered, Don sold the boat business and concentrated on canning. My own business had been in existence for only a short period then. I sought out rare food ingredients, advised on the use of little-known food specialties, recommended new possibilities and marketing opportunities, and put sellers in touch with buyers of exotic food products. I had called myself a food finder at first. Then someone had dubbed me the gourmet detective, and the name had stuck. I thought the title more suited to the flamboyancy of the advertising world than my humble enterprise, but it was an aid in bringing in customers. The only disadvantage was that I had to keep explaining that I wasn't a detective at all, in the usual sense of the word. Some time passed before our paths crossed again. Don was in London and looked me up, enlisting my help in locating new markets for hawthorn, which was widely used in the Middle Ages for heart and blood problems. He told me that he had added an herb and spice operation, and was planning on specializing in this area, as the business was really thriving. When we had our concluding conversation, he told me that his wife, Peggy, had a brother who had emigrated to the States at an early age and done very well with a trucking business. At his instigation, Don had been persuaded to consider opening an American outlet. Don called me once after that. He was back in England briefly, after deciding to move permanently to the States. In New York, his spice warehouse, catering to a rapidly expanding demand for herbs and spices, was doing phenomenally well. I had not heard from him then for some years. Then came the phone call. After we had exchanged greetings, statements of health, interchanges of how long it had been, and so on, Don asked, "How busy are you?" "Things are ticking over," I told him. "Quiet, huh?" "I have been busier," I admitted. "You know how it is, up and down." "How about helping me out with a small job?" "I probably could," I said, not wanting to sound too anxious. "You'd have to come over here." "For how long? I have to give evidence in Scotland next week. Some poaching is going on in the trout streams." "I prefer them grilled myself." "This is the other kind. I have to give evidence on whether I consider that the trout that were caught are the property of a certain laird, or whether they are free souls, blithely independent, owing allegiance to no one, like the poacher. He's innocent until caught with a rod in his hand and a trout on the line." "Well," Don said, "this job won't interfere with that. It'll only take a couple of days, 3 at the most. Besides, it's one you won't be able to resist." I knew Don well enough to know that if he said that, it must be something out of the ordinary. "How long since you were over here last?" he went on. "Some years," I admitted. "And I recall you saying that New York was one of your favorite cities?" "Don, your sales pitch has worked. What's the job?" He chuckled. "I managed to get a contract to authenticate a shipment coming into New York from Asia. I did a job for this outfit once before, and he threw this one my way. The thing is—" He hesitated. "Go on," I urged. "What is the thing?" "Because of the importance of this shipment, the buyer insists on having 2 referees. He's prepared to accept my recommendation on the second referee, and I thought of you." "Authenticate a shipment, you say?" "Right. Like in examine it, smell it, test it, taste it, whatever else. You've got it." "Our choice on methods?" "Yes." "Then declare that to the best of our knowledge, etc., etc." "Right." "Or not, as the case may be." "Absolutely." "Well," I said, "sounds straightforward enough to me. And, Don, you're right. I would like to see the Big Apple again." "It has been some years since you were here, hasn't it? We call it the Big Bagel now. I can count you in, then?" "What's the fee?" $500 a day. Dollars, that is. First-class travel and accommodation. 2 days, maybe 3. You'll be back in time for your fish." "Sounds good. What's the shipment?" There was a couple of seconds' hesitation, which should have given me some kind of a clue. "You know about my spice warehouse, don't you?" he asked. "You mentioned that's what you were going into when I talked to you last." "Yes, well, I've disposed of all the other activities, and I'm really building this business up." "Fine, how's it going?" "Tremendous. Planning on expanding again. In fact—" He paused, and there was a flatness in his tone that sounded peculiar. "After this job, I'll be able to really expand." "And this is a spice shipment that's coming in?" "They're usually pretty easy, emphasis on aroma and taste, difficult to substitute. This one won't be that easy." He paused. "Go on," I urged. "What's the problem? Which spice?" "It's Ko Feng," he said, and I almost dropped the phone. Chapter 3. That conversation had taken place 36 hours earlier. I finished the salad and cut into the steak, which was reasonably succulent, and poured some more Bordeaux. The pepper on the steak activated the tannin in the wine and gave its powers of self-assertion a much-needed boost. The rest of our telephone conversation had been taken up with a discussion of Ko Feng, which was something like playing a game of tennis without a ball. In my business, I often handle spices, so I know something of them and am aware of their long history and the vital part they have played in the annals of food. The ancient world had many famous spices. The earliest of these was what today we refer to as ordinary black pepper, but 2,000 to 3,000 years ago it was anything but ordinary. In fact, it was so valuable that it was sold by the individual peppercorn. All the early trading caravans carried huge quantities of it as they tracked across the deserts of the Middle East, and fortunes were made from a string of camels and a great deal of risk and hardship. The reason for pepper's value was simple. The diet of those days was coarse, monotonous, and unpalatable by modern standards. Food spoiled quickly. Pepper, and later other spices, served 2 purposes. Not only did they add flavor, but their antioxidant qualities retarded spoilage, particularly of meat. Other spices included ginger, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and many others, which are lost to us today. These others were used for drug and medicinal purposes, and extraordinary claims were made for them. The Code of Hammurabi stipulated that a surgeon was to have his hands cut off if a patient died under his care, so it is understandable that the use of drugs was extensive. One papyrus found in China listed 800 herbs and spices with medicinal value, and when the Magi brought their gifts to Bethlehem, myrrh was rated next in value to gold. Myrrh was also the biggest selling commodity in the little spice shop in Mecca run by Muhammad before he became the prophet of Islam. All these thoughts were tumbling through my mind as Don and I exchanged information. He reminded me that silphium was a much sought-after drug in the ancient world and was exchanged on a weight-for-weight basis with silver. It was already extinct by the end of the 1st century. But the most famous of all was Ko Feng, known as the celestial spice. "It's been unknown now for how long? 400 years? 500? I asked Don. "Something like that, maybe more." "And now somebody's found some?" "Right. Or say they have." "That's where you and I come in," he said cheerfully, but I was feeling a slight chill. "This is some authentication job," I said grimly. "Want to back out?" "How could I? This may be one of the most exciting moments in the history of food since Nicolas Appert discovered how to preserve it in cans." "Okay, then you and I are going to have some Ko Feng in our hands next Tuesday." "Or not, as the case may be." "Pessimist? Maybe, but it's hard to believe." "True. I guess I've had a little longer to adjust to it," Don had said. I finished the steak and unwrapped the cheese. It needed to sit exposed to the air for a short time, so that it could recover some taste after its incarceration in aluminum foil and plastic. Don and I had concluded our conversation with details on how, where, and when. I had called him back with flight information, and he had given me hotel reservation numbers. He would like to meet me at JFK, he said, but the buyer of the Ko Feng wanted a last-minute meeting with him. Don's wife, Peggy, would be taking care of the spice warehouse, so she couldn't come either. I assured him that I could easily find my own way to the hotel in Manhattan. Sunlight glinted off the silver wing outside my window. This time tomorrow I would be looking at some Ko Feng, the miraculous spice from thousands of years ago. I tingled with impatience. It was like anticipating a date with Cleopatra. Chapter 4. "Rieger," said the cab driver, jerking a thumb toward his chest. He had a slight stubble and tired eyes, and he wore a cap that was more nautical than automotive. He didn't handle the cab like a true professional, and I presumed he was new at it, perhaps forced to switch jobs by the recession. Evidently he wanted me to know that his name was Rieger, but I was looking at the identification tag fastened to the dashboard. It said that his name was Yanis Rezekna, and his photo looked worse than he did. He told me a lot about himself with a plexiglass slide between us pulled open, another sign that his cab-driving experience was not only recent, but downright contemporary. At least, I supposed he was telling me about himself. I could only understand about 1 word in 10, and wondered if I'd been away from New York too long. But no, that couldn't be the reason, because just last week I had watched an Al Pacino movie on television and understood every other word. I didn't want to uphold my end of the conversation with too much conviction, as I was afraid I might distract him from his driving, which needed a lot more practice. So I managed an occasional nod or look of comprehension. By concentrating on his words, I learned that he was a Latvian and from Riga, which was what he had been proudly trying to tell me. He had only been here 6 months. I would have believed 6 days, but didn't press the point, as he used fingers to illustrate the number, and that didn't leave any hands for the wheel. America was a wonderful country, he told me, and we embroidered on that theme all the way into Manhattan, making full use of our joint vocabulary, which eventually stretched to about 24 words. New York hadn't changed that much, I noted. Traffic was just as thick, and the cars seemed so much bigger, as they always do. The streets were a little dirtier and more untidy, but then, on returning to London after a spell away, that was noticeable there too. People looked more polyglot, as they now look in all big cities. When the cabbie dropped me at the Courtney Park Hotel, it was like the parting of 2 old friends. He clapped me on the back and let me lift my own bags out of the cab. The lobby was stunning, with a tinkling fountain in the center and a chandelier above it that would have had the phantom gnashing his teeth in envy. Shops and boutiques ran off along small streets in all directions from the fountain, and the sign said that the display of life-size sculpture was changed every week. Don Renshaw had meant it when he said that accommodation would be first class. There were lines waiting at each of the 4 check-in desks, and though I switched a couple of times, I was still in the longest when I signed in. I was handed a note from Don saying that he and his wife Peggy would pick me up at 7:30 for dinner. This was my home away from home, the brochure in the room assured me, but they obviously didn't know that my apartment in Hammersmith in West London could fit into the bathroom here. From the window, I could see a corner of Central Park. I had a long and leisurely shower, then watched some television. This was something that had changed in the country since I was here last. Television's emphasis was no longer on entertainment, but on exploitation. I watched in near disbelief as first a black woman was encouraging a studio audience to applaud couples consisting of men and women who had stolen their best friend's spouse. Then a Puerto Rican gentleman was investigating homosexuality in mental institutions. And then an Asian interviewer was telling how she used promises of confidentiality to persuade guests on her show to divulge scurrilous opinions of famous people, then blabbed them on the air. I skimmed through the channels, but Bugs Bunny seemed to be the nearest I could get to entertainment. I dressed and went downstairs. The shops and boutiques were full of fabulous merchandise at what, by London standards, were extremely low prices. I made a second tour and then sat by the fountain until Don and Peggy arrived. They didn't look a lot different, possibly a little fatter and more affluent. Don was stocky, of medium height, with fair, thinning hair and a ruddy complexion. He greeted me effusively. Then Peggy and I exchanged hugs. She was light blonde with a smooth English complexion and eyes that always looked happy. The short taxi ride to the restaurant was taken up with exchanges of information on mutual acquaintances, their progress and problems. It was not until we were seated that I was able to get to the questions that had been burning in my brain ever since Don's phone call. "Sorry to talk business so soon, Peggy," I said. "But this is the most exciting thing that's happened in the food business since an innovative caveman found that meat tasted better cooked than raw. Finding a crop of Ko Feng, it's amazing." Don smiled. "I know. I felt the same way at first. I've had some time to get used to the idea, so I'm finally beginning to accept it. It certainly sounded incredible when I first heard about it." "I take care of the spice warehouse when Don's away, buying or whatever," Peggy said. "So I'm just as enthusiastic as you. I must admit, I hadn't heard of Ko Feng before this, though." "It's been extinct for centuries, so not many people know it," Don said. "Folks in the trade have heard of it, of course, just as many have heard of Malagueta peppers." "Known as the grains of paradise," I contributed. "Nobody expects to hear of either of them cropping up today, though." "Nice choice of a verb," commented Don. "Sorry, it was accidental. But how did somebody find it? And who was it? Was he looking for it? How did he know it was there?" The wine waiter arrived and introduced himself. This is a practice which is creeping into the London restaurant scene, but hasn't made significant headway yet. Under some circumstances, I respond with, "I'm the gourmet detective, and I'll be your customer tonight." But my head was spinning with questions, and anyway, Don was the host. If America is a melting pot, then New York is a cooking pot. Surely no city in the world has so many eating places, and such an enormous variety of ethnic cultures on which they are based. There cannot be any cuisine in the world which is not represented in New York. We were in the Mondragon, one of Manhattan's newer eating establishments. The canopied entrance was in soft French blue with gold lettering. Inside, the stained glass ceiling panels, the elegant mahogany-railed curving staircase leading to the upper dining level, and the luxurious leaf-patterned carpet made a sumptuous background. Don caught me looking around. "Don't worry, the food's as good as the decor." He ordered a bottle of champagne by way of celebration. It was the Dom Renard Brut Blanc de Blanc. "Well, that tells me one thing about the buyer of the Ko Feng. He's paying well for this job," I said, knowing that the price tag would be close to $100 for the bottle. Don nodded. "You were asking about him. Name's Alexander Marvell. He was in the restaurant business for many years, then went into the food importing field here in New York. When I first opened the spice warehouse, he bought some turmeric from me. It was from Alleppey in India, the very best kind, as you know. I've sold him a couple of other shipments since then, but that's all. I was surprised when he picked me for this assignment." "Willard recommended you. That's why Marvell picked you," said Peggy. "Willard Cartwright is Marvell's right-hand man," Don explained. "Nobody better qualified than you, surely," I said. "The spice warehouse must have put you in the forefront of spice experts." "It'll work the other way, too," Peggy added. "There's a lot of prestige involved here. Should boost business in the warehouse by a few %." The wine waiter brought the champagne and opened it expertly. Enough of a pop to satisfy, but not enough to make heads turn. It bubbled perfectly into the glasses, and we drank and studied the menus. Dawn and I both decided on the oysters Rockefeller, while Peggy chose the crab meat with avocado and lemongrass with a red pepper coulis. For the main course, Peggy and Dawn had the rack of lamb, while I ordered the jarret de veau à l'italienne, a refined French version of ossobuco, one of my favorite dishes. We finished the champagne, and Dawn ordered a Diamond Creek Cabernet Sauvignon. The appetizers were excellent, and so were the main courses. Dawn and Peggy's rack of lamb was rosy red and oozing with taste, they told me. My slowly cooked veal shank had been sprinkled with gremolata, that wonderful blend of garlic, parsley, and lemon zest, and it was slightly dry rather than being drenched in braising juices, a common fault with this dish. The imaginative accompaniment was a puree of white beans. The waiters were prompt and attentive, and Dawn and I compared service in New York restaurants with their counterparts in London. "Many's the time I've had to wait 30 minutes for a check in London," Dawn said, "even in the West End. Some restaurants seem to have a positive aversion to bringing it." "English middle-class disdain for any dealings with money," said Peggy. "Anyway, waiting for the check never bothered you. You'd just order another bottle of wine." "Isn't that out of character for a nation of shopkeepers?" I asked. "We never were," Peggy said. "That was just Napoleon's way of showing his contempt." "Or his ignorance," added Dawn. We sipped the wine. "Meanwhile," I said, "back at the Spice Ranch with the Ko Feng." Dawn laughed. "The way it was found, you mean? Alexander Marvell was in Saigon, negotiating a contract for rice. That's one of his biggest commodities. One of the men he was talking to mentioned a cinnamon plantation that he thought Marvell ought to take a look at. Marvell doesn't handle that many spices, so he was reluctant, but he couldn't get a flight out right away, so he went. Well, the way Marvell tells it, they were driving along, and from the jeep, Marvell looked down into a valley where he saw a strange-looking crop. He said it glowed in the setting sun, and he asked what it was. The answer was, just weeds." The waiter brought dessert menus, and I reluctantly tore myself away from Dawn's fascinating story. The specialty was a mascarpone sorbet with wild strawberries, and all three of us ordered it. Dawn continued. "Marvell said he couldn't get the image of that peculiar crop out of his mind. He felt there was something about it that was far out of the ordinary. He went back again the next day and took a sample and went into Saigon to the university." "I have to chip in here," Peggy said. "If Alexander Marvell didn't have an import business, he might be running a religion. He's an extraordinary man. I can just picture him standing there, looking down into that purple valley and having an unshakable conviction that there was something magical about it." Dawn nodded in agreement. "It's true. That's how he is. Anyway, the people at Saigon University were puzzled. It was no weed they recognized, or plant for that matter. So Marvell changed his flight plan back to New York. Instead of going via Bombay and London, he booked in the opposite direction so as to stop off in San Francisco." He broke off and looked at me. "I'm sure you can guess why San Francisco." "Probably because that's where the Mecklenburg Botanical Institute is. They're #1 in that kind of study." "Right. He even stayed in a nearby hotel and pressured them into going into work on the investigation right away. Once they had started, they got really interested, and, to cut a long story short, they eventually concluded that it must be Ko Feng." Which presumably didn't mean much to Marvell at that point. I mean, not being a spice specialist, there would be no reason for him to even know the name. He didn't. Once he read up on it, though, he became really excited. "I hate to ask such a crass commercial question," I said, "but how much do you suppose Ko Feng is worth on today's market?" Dawn grinned. "It's okay to ask the question. You're in the US of A now. Commercialism comes with the territory. This wouldn't be the country it is without commerce. Money lubricates the wheels of progress." "We still want to know how much," Peggy said, tapping a spoon on the table for emphasis. "I was asking you this question the other day, and I never did get an answer." Dawn spread his hands. "It's so hard to say. How can you value something like this? It's worth whatever someone wants to pay." "Sort of like the Mona Lisa?" Peggy asked. "In a way, yes." Or that Van Gogh that a Japanese bought for $30 million? They'll do as examples. What's the Van Gogh worth? Wood, paint, and canvas, total $20. The Mona Lisa? Maybe less. The materials are older. There is a difference, though, I pointed out. When 1 million visitors to the Louvre have looked at the Mona Lisa, another 1 million can come and look at it. When this spice has all been eaten up, then what? The scarcity makes it all the more valuable, Don said. Peggy looked at Don. Hasn't Marvell said anything about value? I haven't been able to get any clue from him as to what he's going to sell it for. Will we get some? Peggy wanted to know. Doubt it. I told him I'd like some, though. What does saffron sell for now? I asked. It's the most valuable spice there is today. At the point of retail sale, about $200 an ounce, Don replied. Ko Feng must be worth far more than that, like 10 times more, I pressed. More, probably. And the shipment is, what did you say, Don, about 40 kilograms? About that. Peggy was doing quick sums on the tablecloth with a fork. That's $2 to $3 million, she said softly. We sat silent for a moment, all of us awestruck at the thought of such wealth in such a simple form. The dessert arrived to end our reverie. It was superb. The piquancy of the wild strawberries contrasted perfectly with the smoothness of the mascarpone, which is one of the newer arrivals on the dessert scene, though a long popular cheese in Italy. Peggy ordered tea, Don and I coffee. Before it came, I had already asked the big question. About tomorrow, how do we go about authenticating a spice that has been unknown for centuries? We sat over coffee discussing it until the waiter came by for the second time to ask if we wanted more coffee or anything further. Big day tomorrow, Don said, examining the check. Pick you up about 8 o'clock. There'll be some formalities to go through before the flight gets in at 10:45. I can hardly wait, I said. And I really meant it. Chapter 5. It was cold with a blustery wind, and there was the threat of rain from a gray sky. The yawning expanse of the cargo area at JFK added to the bleak aspect of the morning, but I was tingling with anticipation. It was a rare occasion, and I was going to enjoy every minute of it. At the entrance, we had shown our identification and signed in. The security man assigned to the hangar we were heading for was waiting, and he joined us. He was a rugged-looking young man with a determined, no-nonsense air about him. His name was Karl Eberhard, and he had a slight but unmistakable German accent. Don followed his directions, and we pulled up in front of a large hangar with BLS 12 painted on the side in red letters. A cargo tow truck stood near it with a flatbed trailer. We walked into the hangar. It was cold, and the bare concrete floor made it even colder. Voices echoed several times before becoming lost in the cavernous ceiling. Along the length of one wall of the hangar, several bays were separated by partitions. Each bay had desks, chairs, benches, tables. In the first one, 6 men sat playing cards. The second had several men and benches and tables that were littered with equipment. Karl Eberhard led us toward this second bay, and I noticed that the third bay was empty, except for a big black car. 3 or 4 men were talking in the fourth bay, and 2 more bays were empty. A closed pickup truck sat in front of the first bay, a gray van was at the entrance of our bay, and there was a shiny new rental van by the fourth bay. Don held out his hand toward one of the men in the bay we entered. "Hello, Willard. Didn't expect to see you here. Where's the boss?"
"Something vital came up. He can't make it. He asked me to take care of it. It's just formalities here anyway."
Don took my arm and introduced me. Then, to me, he said, "This is Willard Cartwright, Alexander Marvell's assistant." We shook hands. He was lean and spare, light on his feet and lively in his movements. His face was older than his body, creased and worn, but the faded blue eyes were quick and intelligent. He introduced Don and me to the others. Arthur Appleton, of Far East Air Freight Lines, was balding and shivering in a lightweight suit.
"Coldest building in the airport,"
he said.
"Good for your spice, I guess, but it's not very friendly to humans."
Sam Rong was a Cambodian representing the sellers, who had a series of Asian names which I promptly forgot. He was short and had one of those smooth and unlined faces which was probably 20 years.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?